rather than wait. My name is Rakesh. I'm the founder and CEO of SnapStream, where our mission is to help our customers harness the power of moments. And I'm joined here today in our first as a part of the SnapStream Live series, where we interview customers and influencers in the news and the media space. But I'm joined here today by our first guest, Mosheh Oinounou. Did I pronounce it correctly?
You got it, Rakesh.
Yes. As somebody who's always had their name mispronounced, I'm very happy about that.
The proud. Yes.
So Mosheh, thank you for joining us. Your title is founder of Mo News. What are you? Chief cook and bottle washer?
When you start your own company, it's always, you're like, what title am I giving myself? But founder and editor in chief is what I go with here as we continue to expand to multiple media platforms.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Welcome. Thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to digging into a lot of different subjects. I really do think about you as a founder, and I think you know this about me, but maybe some people in the audience know this, but I'm an investor in a bunch of early stage, mostly software companies, but early stage companies. But I've been a student of entrepreneurship and innovation and disruption for many years. And whether it's like as a founder of SnapStream or an investor in these other early stage companies. So that's really how I look at you and Mo News. Love what you've built. I would love to have you start by giving us the origin story of Mo News. I've heard a little bit of it before the pandemic, first time in your living room versus the newsroom, and so of course, share with everyone your background as well. But that'd be a great starting point. Tell me how this thing got started.
So you go back to the beginning. I've always been obsessed with media and news from a very young age. I was actually visiting my parents in Fort Worth, Texas, a couple days ago, and my mom kept, as some mothers do, keep all my projects. And I wrote an essay in fourth grade saying I would be an anchorman one day. So this started early for me. Spent a couple decades at a number of national media organizations, Fox News, Bloomberg Television, and CBS News. And so for me, Mo News is a product of my experiences there and lessons learned there. Took a break from it. Wanted a break from daily news, and then 9 months later, so the summer 2019, spring 2020, the pandemic hits, and we all found ourselves quarantined to a certain extent, and I found myself getting questions from friends and family. Break down what's happening here. Like, this is really a scary situation, and I found myself utilizing the skills that I picked up in various newsrooms, which is like, how do I synthesize data? Who are the trustworthy people reporting things out? What are the questions we should be asking? How do we separate the politics from the facts at the time? And found myself, like many people, frustrated by what I was seeing, confused as to where to turn to. And so I, at that moment, found that I had 500 or so friends and family on my Instagram account. I liked that on Instagram stories. It's the last place in social media where you can put together a chronological story and not an algorithmic story. And so I felt like that was my best, of course you could thread on Twitter or whatever, but I also found Twitter just not be a place I wanted to do news. It was oversaturated, it's overly negative. And Instagram felt like the place I could communicate with friends and family. Anyway, so I started doing that and watching Fauci briefings and watching Cuomo and watching Trump and reading stat news and the Financial Times and trying to find things. And my wife comes to me and was like, you should open up your account. It was a private account. I was like, for what? She's like, I think other people would find this useful. Okay, let's see. And suddenly, it started to grow in this first few weeks of the pandemic, and several thousand people started following me. And then some celebrities started following me. And then a few weeks in, Joe Jonas tells everyone, Joe Jonas, like the singer from the Jonas Brothers, finds me and tells everyone, you got to follow this guy. I'm like, whoa, I've tapped into something. And what I thought was an exercise in effectively keeping myself busy and informing friends and family, I realized tapped into something greater, which is people's need for information, trustworthy information, the abject lack of trust that exists for major organizations, and the larger feeling that we've entered this creator influencer world where people want to feel like they're getting lifestyle tips or beauty tips or nutrition tips or travel tips, or in this case, the news from somebody individual that they trust.
Yeah. Yeah, tell me about the trust, because we talked about this before, before this interview. That's, I mean, it sounds like that's really the crux of the product that you offer is providing people with a trustworthy source. And you've scaled that to, what's your audience now?
We- Daily, about 500,000 people between podcast, newsletter, and Instagram.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something I think I feel like it's at the core of what you do is establishing this trust. How do you do that?
There's a few ways we approach it. Number one, I make a point, and it's hard, right? But of you are going to get nonpartisan news. We are going to try our best in the year well, it was 2020, now it's 2023, to provide you with just the facts, where we'll also call BS on lies, but at the end of the day, we will make a point of providing the information that we think is important for you to make a decision about what's happening. That's item one. Item two, we're transparent about what we don't know. And I think, and I'll admit, during my time working at various media organizations, we felt obligated to make people know that we have a command for everything that's going on. We will tell you what's happening. When in fact, I think it does help with trust to say, you know what? We don't actually know what's going on. And I think that's one of the lessons from those early stages of COVID, Rakesh, whether we talk about the mask situation, you don't need masks, you do need masks, the vaccine's going to prevent spreading, but actually it didn't actually, lessen the contagion. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that would come out later that then leads the consumer to say, well, they told me X and the truth turned out to be Y. So now why can I trust them on anything else they say? And that's the problem we have, is we're kind of in this post-truth society. So transparency about what we don't know and we do know is important. And I think one other key aspect to trust, Rakesh, is that we make a genuine attempt to answer people's questions, no matter what the question is, no matter whether it's how many justices are there in the Supreme Court, or why, what's the deal with primary elections? Stuff that you might have learned in junior high civics or high school civics, but you live life, you have families, you have a job, you have a variety of things. You don't restudy your social studies book from high school. So I'm not here to judge, I'm here to answer. And frankly, we allow, in many cases on a daily basis, the consumer, the audience, to help dictate what we're covering. What are you guys interested in? What are you seeing? And in many cases, I'll see stories bubbling up. I mean, one good example recently was the Sound of Freedom movie about child trafficking, which wasn't garnering much attention outside of the conservative media. But I was getting a dozen questions a day when it came out. And it took a couple of weeks before the mainstream media picked up on it. And so I just feel like staying close to the audience and figuring out what they're interested in is one avenue to ensuring, I trust this media outlet. They seem to be responsive to the types of questions and the issues we care about.
What have been the inflection points in the growth of that audience? You're at 500,000 now across all these different channels. Can you point at events or developments in your offering that have represented like greater jumps in that audience size that have kind of like taken you to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, it really is revolved around a handful of major news stories. So there's early COVID, those first couple of months of COVID, stage one. Black Lives Matter, summer of 2020, stage two. The election, the final couple of weeks before the election aftermath in January 6th would be another inflection point. Then the Israeli-Gaza war of May 2021. It's interesting, I'm kind of going through chronology. A huge one was the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021. The feeling that, again, that's where I thought that our format is effective in telling people the story, because it wasn't always what's happening now. It's like, there's actually a 5,000-year history of Western countries trying to invade Afghanistan. So it's like, remind me who the Taliban is. Why are we there again? Like, what's the deal with X, Y, and Z? And I got a huge influx of audience from military families that were genuinely concerned
Oh.
about what was happening there, including, and this was fascinating, veterans that were trying to get their interpreters out. And so what happened, Rakesh, is that
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
I was hearing from people, like I got 7 people trying to make it to the airport. And I'm like, well, based on the latest BBC and Sky News reports, it appears the North Gate is closed and the South Gate's open right now. Oh, thank you. And then I was being let in on WhatsApp groups where they were showing me how they were trying to get people out. And so
Mm.
that's where the kind of unique nature of being in touch with your audience really allowed you to, stay close to the ground on both what was happening there and what was happening here. And then I was finding that, anonymous embassy officials from various countries were letting me in on what was happening. So I felt like I had a real time access to what was happening. So that was a huge moment. The beginning of the Ukraine war, the invasion by Russia was another huge moment. And incidentally, not as, not international conflict by any stretch of the imagination, but the most recent, the Southwest Airlines fiasco of last winter. Um, you know, Again, I felt like I was hearing from people that about that really early on, and giving people real time information about that was also interestingly a story that was very closely followed and brought in a good audience to us.
Yeah, really interesting. So then, essentially there are these crucible moments that have occurred in global news, and those have been the sources of influx. And maybe those are moments of like greater complexity, for example.
Yeah, I mean, a thing I like to say is that the news, has always been going, and you tune in the middle of a movie, in the middle of a TV show,
Mm,
and as journalists, we take for granted, because we've been living it every day, that you've been living it every day. And you're like,
yeah.
actually, I haven't. I have not checked in on Afghanistan or Iraq. Like people will still ask me, like, we have soldiers in Iraq. I was like, we do. 20 years later, why? Well, let me tell you. A good example today. The latest ISIS leader was killed again. I think it's their 5th leader in 5 years.
Mm,
Wait, there's still ISIS? Well, let me explain to you what ISIS is today, and the fact that there's at least 1,000 U.S. troops still in Syria fighting ISIS after years after we declared victory over them. And so people want that background, that context, and that's where the nature of television, having produced television, you only have a certain number of minutes or seconds to tell a story, and so you're not able to provide that context, that history, answer those questions, provide that background. And so I think that there's something to the Instagram format, and frankly, social media itself. I'm not going to limit it to Instagram, whether it's TikTok or Twitter, or I guess what do we have, Threads now. There are ways that social media is uniquely capable of being able to answer all those types of questions that update you on the first half of the movie.
yeah. You almost what you talk about almost points at the need for like a video Wikipedia, which provides background information, right? Where you could say, oh, like, hey, wait, before I like listen to this story or watch this story on ISIS, like give me like the 30-second, 60-second backgrounder. We all do this today where
Yeah.
like we don't know something, we don't have a piece of background information. And it's not exclusively Wikipedia, but it's like often Wikipedia, right? But in a visual context, how can we get that kind of like, up to date, quick background?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like Quora tried to be that, right? If I'm really dating myself, remember AskJeeves.com back in
Oh
the
yeah,
early internet days? Interestingly, Rakesh, that's the way that many people, especially Gen Z, is using TikTok, right? They're
right.
using
Yeah,
TikTok as effectively video Wikipedia. The unfortunate thing is, I guess the fortunate and unfortunate thing is there are no gatekeepers. That's the greatest part here. There is no longer gatekeepers. The worst
yeah,
part is there are no longer gatekeepers. So, oftentimes on a daily basis, the questions I'm getting involve sending me a link to a video that somebody's watched, being like, is this true? 75% of the time it's not, but it
yeah.
really depends. But that's the thing, is we are in this kind of wild, wild west of information. And this speaks to the lack of trust in media institutions, but also the stories that they're covering that aren't necessarily plugged into what people are genuinely concerned about. The media is not always answering all the questions, or even some of the biggest questions people have. And so that's what is leading people to seek out alternatives. And so, Wikipedia, is this great encyclopedia, And actually, I think it's gotten much better through the years with more people involved in it, etc. But because I remember there was a time 20 years ago that like Wikipedia was a complete whatever. But at the same time, if you throw a question about ISIS or the airlines or Ukraine or whatever into TikTok,
what are you going to get? You don't know.
What are you going to get? Are you going to get something from the BBC? Or are you going to get the BBCCC? Which, some people are like, have you seen the story? I'm like, that's a made up outlet. Have you ever heard of like USA News with 3 S's before? Like, that's not a thing.
Yeah, no, I have young adult kids and, or one young adult kid and like we have this conversation all the time, or we had it a long time ago. Like my kids have, I think, pretty decent hygiene when it comes to like, what's the source on that? Is it a credible source? Should I question this? Should I find a more credible source? All of that, right? Like that.
By the way, I like your use of the word hygiene there. I haven't heard that in the news context before.
Yeah. So going back to the audience, I also like, I think that's one of the most innovative things that you do is you almost co-create your program with your audience, right? You have this two-way, fully participatory thing going with your audience. I mean, we have this webinar going. There's a chat. I haven't seen if there are any questions yet. No, it doesn't look like there are yet. But you're constantly fielding questions. I mean, you're also like, in some cases, it sounds like helping, navigate traffic on the ground in a crisis, which is kind of crazy. But I'm curious, like how that's developed, right? Like you started out with 500 people, and you'd answer questions as they came in on, all these various channels. Now you're at 500,000. What's been the evolution of that interactivity with people? Has it, taken any kind of formal shape? Have you enlisted some of your audience to be in like a tier above the regular tier? Are any of them like, curators for you, where you've identified that, oh, hey, these audience members are greater news junkies, and so I can rely on them to help me create the program? Just curious how that relationship is involved with your audience.
I actually think that's a great idea, Rakesh. It's kind of the Wikipedia model, right? Like elevating editors or whatever. What's interesting is, as we've evolved this, one of the things, I had to make a decision on is like, is this going to be a business? Is this going to be my profession, or am I going to return to, network news or consulting or the stuff I was doing on the side? And, once I saw we put up a Patreon page in the fall of 2020, so about 6 months in, being like, hey, if you like what we're doing and you want me to continue it, subscribe to Patreon, monthly, annual, etc. And several hundred people immediately did that. I was like, oh, I guess there could be something here in terms of monetization. So we made a concerted effort, like, let's figure out how to monetize. One of the things that, we made a decision on is we got to move beyond Instagram and do a podcast and do a newsletter, which are much more advanced ecosystems when it comes to advertising and sponsorships. It's a challenge to do monetized news on Instagram. It just doesn't lend itself to as many partners as you get in the lifestyle space. One thing that we launched recently, speaking to your question about tiers, is premium, what we call Mo News Premium. So that enables folks to, based on a monthly or annual fee, they get access to a members only Instagram. And that's where I'm interacting daily with people, answering a couple dozen questions a day. Everything from, anything that's on people's mind. What's up with that, shady CDC discovered lab in California, to, does Mike Pence have a chance, to whatever's on the top of people's minds. And they'll also then get access to extra podcast editions, early access, et cetera. So we've created a tier of people. And these, again, are the people probably who, have been plugged in for a while, really like what we're doing. I trust to be able to have a sensible, civil conversation, which is challenging on social media. I mean, what's crazy in the last couple of years, I think most media organizations have cut out their comments, opportunity to comment on stories, because like of the direction those comments go, and frankly, the liability that it could lead to. And so we've created a premium tier. And so like many media companies, we're trying to balance like, okay, what are we going to do in terms of advertising and partnerships? And what can we do in terms of subscriptions for a group? But I think what's important to me is I don't want to paywall off all my content, because that's at cross purposes with my general goal, which is like, I want people to have good information on a basic level, and it should be available for free.
Yeah. Yeah, so the monetization is basically, there are two components to it. There's sponsorship, and then now this subscription revenue. Is that right? Those are the
Yes.
two components. And you had sponsorships, advertising, essentially, before you turned on this subscription model. And so, how's it going? How is Mo News as a business going?
It's going. It's month over month, we continue to grow. I'm very ambitious. We're very ambitious here, and so we want to continue to grow it. And the one thing we want to do is make it sustainable. The advertising market is what it is. So to the extent that we can get some sort of tent-pole sponsors and partners, that would be ideal. I spent almost a decade at CBS News, and one of the things that we did, especially as we were launching the streaming platform, was try to look back at the archives and figure out what content through the years could we leverage. And what was remarkable to me is, sort of the media goes in cycles, and we're sort of at the same stage now that sort of like early TV was. Like, this entire episode brought to you by Virginia Slims, and the Edward R. Murrow, like smoking a cigarette or whatever. I'm not taking any tobacco advertising, but by that I mean, like, it'd be great to, like, Virginia Slims, like, brought to you, Mo News brought to you by X. And so then you can rest assured you have one big sponsor, they stay out of your editorial matters, and then you can move ahead, with your content and grow. And I think, a big question for any entrepreneur, and this, any startup, is like, do you take outside money? And at this point, I'm bootstrapping it as we continue to see growth. And we've seen really incredible growth on the subscription front in the first 90 days. And so then the question is, what can we do to continue to grow that? Because we have sort of the initial group that has come in who very much want to support us. And some of them even like, I want to support you. I'll give you money. I don't care if you give me anything in return. And then you hit the stage of like, okay, what about the rest of the consumers out there? What are the things behind the wall that won't limit your overall growth on the free platforms, but will incent people to come aboard and subscribe? And you've seen this, like, if you follow various media companies, like the New York Times has tried many different, every publication has, like, do we put our opinion behind the paywall? Do we put X behind the paywall? And I think that's a constant challenge for any media company, which is what to make free and available, what freemium model to really have.
Yeah, well, I mean, and when you launch recipes, like, that's going to be the real moneymaker, right? As I understand, it is at the New York Times.
My wife's an incredible cook with great recipes, actually. So maybe listen, I think that one of the things you discover in media, even if you look at the kind of unique models at Axios and the Washington Post, is as you figure out your revenue pie, what ends up bringing in certain revenue might not be traditional content or media at all, but some sort of offshoot, some sort of service you can provide that helps then pay for the editorial.
Sure. Yeah. So, like, you mentioned that the premium offering today is this private Instagram channel. By the way, I'm a subscriber as of yesterday.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. But you have this private Instagram channel. And what else was there? There's early access to the podcast.
Right. It's a members only podcast. So exclusive episodes and early access. Yeah.
And early access. So what do you see potentially adding to that in terms of the premium offering?
So one of the things that we do is we'll also, do kind of deep dive stories on, various topics. So here, like, actually funny, somebody said, I have a challenge for you. Do the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict over the last 5,000 years. And I was like, okay, we'll do it on premium. Challenge accepted. So I think over like 52 slides, I presented, from the Phoenicians to, Benjamin Netanyahu. And so we make that available in highlights on the Instagram channel. One of the goals, we're continuing to build out the Mo News website right now, and we see that as a place where we'll be able to provide those deep dives. And one of the other things that's been requested, and we're looking into, is also putting together courses for people. So, and so ultimately making those courses available on the Mo News website as a premium offering, which is explaining the Supreme Court, explaining the history of Russia and Ukraine, various topics that we think are relevant and provide you what you need to know. And so sort of masterclass for news topics.
What are some things that you've tried that have failed in the course of building Mo News? Right. I mean, because you as a founder, you go down some blind alleys that don't yield you anything. Right. You conduct experiments that fail, that you learn from, and lead to the thing that succeeds.
One of the things is just learning to evolve the platform. I think that I have probably seen growth that hasn't. My growth has been limited by not pivoting quick enough. So, for example, this whole thing began by posting a whole bunch of stories on Instagram. The thing about Instagram stories is they're not widely shareable. You can't just click and share them to everybody. So but in the height of COVID, stories made sense because the story was evolving minute by minute. So I think I stuck to that format, devoting a lot of time and effort to creating stories that were not eminently shareable, and ultimately thereby limiting my growth and reach. So I think pivoting to more permanent posts, reels, doing as more on camera stuff. I think one of the things you learn in social media as a creator is you have to play to where the platform is going and pivot to that. So I think, that was one thing, is just, embracing on camera, etc. I would say, I'm probably belatedly trying to grow a TikTok presence, which also requires a lot of video. Now, interestingly, Instagram much more reliable than TikTok, but TikTok has a much higher ceiling than Instagram. So I could put the same video out. I could put 5 videos out. I know on Instagram about how many views I'm going to get on each one. On TikTok, literally one video could get 52 views and the next one could get 4.2 million. And it's blind, but the 4.2 million, suddenly you have a few thousand more people who follow you. So you have to sort of throw the darts in the TikTok world. So I think that, I would say that, my biggest mistakes were probably just not embracing podcasts early enough, not pivoting the nature of the Instagram content quick enough. And what are some other things that I tried and failed? I think that even my early Patreon experiment, right? Like not embracing that subscription, because my assumption, my default was that like, I'm going to be, and I know everyone's different, but like I'm going to be vast majority partnerships advertising. I called it 90-10. I'll be 90% advertising, 10% subscription. And I think that I've realized over time, if you can build a good loyal group of subscribers at a certain, amount, you can actually build the business that way in a sustainable way that isn't contingent on a contract with X corporation for 3 more months and, holding out hope that gets extended.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said. You left traditional news. You were pretty senior at CBS News, right? And you said you were taking a break for 9 months. Had you done that before? And what were you seeking in that break? Like, what were you? Why did you take a break at that stage?
So CBS News had made a decision to move. I was running the evening news, the CBS Evening News at the time. And they wanted to move the show to Washington. They chose a new anchor and they wanted a new team to relaunch the show down there. And I'd spent 9 years at CBS in 5 different roles. I'd come aboard to help launch the morning show with Gayle King and Charlie Rose back in the day. I ran streaming, did some startups for them. And they're like, well, we have X, Y, and Z still available. I was like, you know what, I'll take the buyout. This has been a very stressful, running the evening news is probably the most stressful job I ever had.
Wow.
You're managing 200 people around the world. It's ironic because you're putting together a 30-minute broadcast that after commercials is 21 minutes, but it's a 24/7 job. It's like 3 a.m. you get a phone call. I remember like there's been a massacre at a mosque in New Zealand. How do we launch someone? How do we get them there by 6 p.m. Eastern? And you're like globally talking to Beijing and you're talking to the people in Hong Kong and Tokyo and London. And you're like, okay, who gets there first? Is LA going to get there first? It's like you're playing travel agent and running editorial and then managing a lot of personalities, well-paid personalities. And it's a lot. It's a lot. And it's ironic actually when I think about it is I was probably furthest from the audience in a role that had the most audience, right? 6 or 7 million people watch the show every night. I had no idea what the audience wants because I'm so caught up in managing internal personalities, the producers, the this, etc. And so I just felt burnt out by the entire thing and felt like, honestly, I was pursuing documentary work. I was like, it'd be fun not having to wake up every day and wait for the whatever's happening, like, let me just dive deep into one topic and produce a great documentary every couple of years. So I remember interviewing at those types of places, and I was sort of just, I needed to hit pause and reset. And because honestly, the day-to-day news in that world and doing that wasn't fulfilling me. And I also felt like we're all going to fall a cliff, because ultimately I see the ratings. And if you follow the ratings for cable news and network news right now, today, it's about managing decline. How do
Yeah.
you decline the least? People are going to other alternative platforms. So I felt like in my digital roles at CBS, I got to innovate much more. And that by going to the, the evening news that Walter Cronkite used to anchor and yada, 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 really cool, really unique, gave me great perspective and great reach. But like, that world isn't going to exist for very long. And so I felt like I need to go do something, given that I got 30 years left in my career, where I feel like I'm going to move towards the future. The Wayne Gretzky quote, you go to where the puck is going, right? You move with
Right.
the puck.
Yeah. And I want to ask you later about where you think the puck is going in the world of news, especially like indie news creators like you. You talked about burnout, and now you're running this startup in the news world, and news is like nonstop. So, and you tell also as a part of this, like, I'd love to hear about the team. And you started out doing the solo. You mentioned that your wife said, "Hey, go public instead of being private," and it kind of launched this thing. How have you managed the work-life balance doing this solo, at least to begin with?
It's, as any entrepreneur will tell you, it's that it itself is a lifestyle. So it's like, but it's a lifestyle that I have found more fulfilling than reporting to a boss who reports to another boss who, tells you, exactly what to do with those 5 seconds of your show. So there's an autonomy to it. I find myself, it's great to have that check from my wife on like, hey, like, you need to put everything down right now, and take care of yourself, because sometimes I get caught up in that stuff. But, I think that, as I'm building this, it does mean that, it's a 7-day a week job. Now, it's not equal time 7 days a week, but ultimately it's 7 days a week. I'd love to be able to build this into a way where I can have a more traditional, if you say, 5-day a week role, where I actually am able to reset. Now, what's nice about this is I can also take this wherever I'm going. So we can go on a vacation, and like, it doesn't, like, we were in Charleston on a baby moon recently, because my wife is due this fall, and that's when the Prigozhin uprising, mutiny was attempted in Russia. And I was like, all right, we're going to head to dinner. There's really good dinner, but like, on the way in the Uber, I have to post about the mutiny in Russia. So
Sure.
I'm trying, sure, totally. Like, it's funny. The Uber driver was
like Walter Cronkite, right? Like he did.
I mean, that's how Cronkite did the Kennedy assassination, in an Uber to Charleston.
Yeah.
So I'm still, I think my answer to that question, short, Rakesh, is TBD. Still working on the work-life balance, but there's the positives to doing it on the go and having a mobile function. But there's also the challenges of, like, if, trying to make this work, the world doesn't necessarily work on your, the news world never works on your schedule.
Yeah. And I love the fact that I love the call out that, the lifestyle is fulfilling in terms of like being your own boss and being able to, be at the steering wheel and steer this, wherever you want to take it. Right. And I don't just mean like taking it with you on the road. I mean, deciding what happens and, conducting the experiments, right. That's invigorating and that's exciting and that's fun. Right. Do you think that there are enough, independent innovators in the news space? Why or why not?
Welcome, one and all, please.
Yeah.
I think that, I did not fully grasp, where the traditional media stood with the public until I left the traditional media. And I try to tell that to my former colleagues at traditional media, some of whom are trying to recruit me back into roles at various networks. And I'm like, there's very few jobs, if any, I still want in that world, because for a variety of reasons. But I will tell them, you're making a big mistake by not building your own brand, by not building your own presence. I think that we live in the world now where everybody is their own media company, right? You're your own media company between your social media accounts and the ability to start a newsletter on Substack and a live stream on YouTube or Twitch or whatever. You're your own media
Mm.
company. If you have unique talent, a unique ability to explain something, then leverage that, right? Launch the podcast that does X, Y, Z. Now, monetizing that is the challenge in a world of millions of podcasts and millions of newsletters, etc. But if you're
Right.
providing a service, if you have a unique, you can tell a good story, you can do, compelling original reporting, then you don't need that 3-letter network or 4-letter network, behind you. You can do it on your own. And I think there's a lot of interesting examples of that. Even like my friend Jake Sherman and Anna Palmer, who were at Political Playbook, and we're like, actually, there's a way to do this where we just devote ourselves to covering Congress for people who need to know every iteration of Congress. So they launched something called Punchbowl News, and it's been hugely successful. And so you can really niche yourself in that way. As far as the creator space is concerned, like on Instagram, there's a number of people who do financial explainers really well. There's a woman named Cleo Abram on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok who does like science and like explains how things work. And she comes from a world at Vox. Vox is an interesting media company that began by just, we're going to explain the background of things, right? We're going to take that step back for
Yep.
everybody. And so she's doing that. And there's another woman called the Space Gal who does like astronomy explainers, both for kids and for adults, of what's happening in the solar system and whatnot, and what's happening with NASA. So, and there's another person, Sharon McMahon, who's a former government teacher who has 1 million followers on Instagram, who launched a podcast, and she started actually just after me because QAnon was frustrating her, and she's like, let me explain government to people. So on a daily basis, she's explaining the basics of government to people.
Yeah.
And so I think that the ecosystem is growing, but it could use more reliable people that are just facts first, because for the most part, it's all opinion makers. A lot of people coming in with an agenda and who aren't necessarily vetting information and data, because honestly, that doesn't get you the follows. The OMG, can you believe X happened? Like gets you the follows. And then if it turns out not to be true, they don't really hold themselves accountable. So I would love people with a journalistic background who, will correct themselves. Like there's certain things you learn as tenets of journalism, and that's what's missing from the creator space right now.
Yeah, I have to say, like, one of the things you bring to your product is your energy and your vibe, which is like a pretty chill vibe. Like I think back to what you were saying about, news is like has to be very authoritative and can't say I don't know, and but also the cadence with which they talk, right, has been caricatured because it's ridiculous, right? Like they speak in this very stilted. Yeah.
No,
Very.
what's wild, Rakesh? At CBS, I'd have like, young people in their mid-20s coming in as like new anchors, and I'm like, why are you talking like that? And I'm realizing that like journalism schools are training people for a bygone era. And I've spoken at several journalism schools where I was like, how are you training the TikTok storytelling? They're like, well, we're not. I'm like, wake up. You're training people for an era that doesn't exist anymore or is dying. And so ultimately you need to be conversational. And this is a big thing too. Like I did an explainer yesterday on the premium account, actually. People are like, what's the Hunter Biden thing all about? I'm like, one thing that most media companies won't tell you is like they screwed up 2020. They bought the Biden line, and what Republicans are telling you, not necessarily like all true. What the Biden people told you, not necessarily all true. The truth, typically, we live in shades of gray in this world. It's somewhere in the middle. But I think being able to have an open and honest conversation where it's like, no, you know what, we screwed that up. We should hold ourselves accountable. Whereas in the media, it's like, like even this recent example of the CNN president, Chris Licht, losing his job. And in that profile, I think one thing that came out, that infamous profile is he had said, I feel like, we need to own up to our COVID coverage. Like we necessarily, that there are things that we, need to think about and reassess. And there's a knee jerk at many people in companies to be like, what do you mean? We did great at X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, in the same way that journalists hold everyone else accountable, we got to hold ourselves accountable. We need to have our own admissions of whatever. How do we get better? The only way that we can grow an audience and grow a foundation and grow trust is we have to admit when we may have missed something or may have, bought something that wasn't true. And so I think that, like having, just admitting, like, and I know that doesn't necessarily work for certain politicians these days, but I think in journalism, being absolute, being like, we always get, whatever. It's like, it's incredible. I think somebody noted recently, like the role of an ombudsman. An ombudsman is what many newspapers used to have, somebody who was self-critical of the newspaper, and they would have like a weekly column being like, here are our hits and misses, folks. Here's the good, bad, and ugly of what we did this week. I don't know any many institutions that have that role anymore. And I think that would be so valuable for media companies. And I think honestly, it would earn trust, being like, you know what, I like that every week they talk about what they messed up or what they missed.
At what point does Mo News become too big? Like that you can't keep doing what you're doing. Is there a break point? You started at 100 or 500, and now you're at 500,000. What is the point at which something's got to change, you think?
Honestly, it's about growing to the audience, right? Like it's not at the point anymore where like Mosh by himself can do all of this and ensure that there's a podcast every day and ensure that there's a newsletter every day. So we've grown the team. So we have an audio editor who handles the podcast, and then I have a co-host, Jill, who contributes to the newsletter, edits the newsletter, and co-hosts the podcast with me. I have a video editor, Khalid, who edits our video. I'm sitting in a room right now with two of our summer interns who are contributing. I have a producer who just devotes herself to Instagram. And so, the next step for me, frankly, is to hire someone on the business end to help with, marketing, growth, sales, partnerships, etc. And so the only limit there is the bootstrapping nature. If I took outside money, I could probably, hire and scale quickly. But I think that's where we're at. It's a good problem to have, being too big. I'm not there yet. The one thing I never want to lose, though, is the voice of what we do and staying in touch with the audience. And I feel like that's something that's always a concern when you have a startup, that when it grows, it's not what it was. And sometimes that's been my fear of taking outside money and finding the right investors, is I want to ensure that they don't end up dictating the direction that's at cross purposes with the voice and the initial goal of the institution.
Yeah, I really like the fact that you're growing it organically, right? It means that you're having to make the money before you spend the money, and so that's going to force a discipline on the way that you make investments versus potentially growing too fast, or hiring somebody before you really need to hire someone, right? There's a real benefit. There's a discipline that comes with growing organically.
One of the early followers of the Instagram account was Barbara Corcoran, who you might know from Shark Tank, who sold her business. So Barbara had me on her podcast. I've had her on my podcast. And one thing she said to me when I was on her podcast is, that she believes in her time at Shark Tank, et cetera, is that some of the best products, the best companies have come from situations where they aren't given $20 million to go spend, that they actually have to look at their ledger every month and say, are we going to be able to make it? That you're much smarter with what you're investing in and how you're investing in it when there's not an unlimited supply of money coming your way. And it's funny because I just spoken to, my last consulting project before I launched Mo News was Quibi. I was helping Condé Nast launch video shows for Quibi, a short-lived attempt at a short-form video, the Netflix for short-form video. And Quibi spent upwards of $1 billion on something that lasted less than 6 months.
Yeah, we got some of those dollars. There were all of the news shows on Quibi were using SnapStream for their clips. So we were some sort of a beneficiary. Didn't help our churn numbers.
Well, I was going to say a lot of media organizations, got a nice little boost from Quibi in the year 2020.
Yeah, exactly. So talking about platforms, you mentioned, you've jumped on TikTok, and you're also out on, you have a podcast, and you distribute that podcast, and you monetize the podcast. what what are some of like the non-obvious lessons you've learned about the different platforms? You also mentioned, I think, that Instagram is hard to monetize. It's
For
difficult to
news. I mean, some
for
people are
news for
making
news.
7, 8 figures off of Instagram. So
Sure.
I want to be very specific there. Um, I think that, like if I was doing fashion, cosmetics, there's certain elements there. At the same time, though, I think it's gradually growing. It's a matter of finding also brands that um, embrace what you're doing and also embrace those platforms. Something I've discovered in this world is like I'll often, like I have sponsorship with a certain brand. And I actually talk to two completely different departments for their Instagram ads and for their podcast ads. For one, they
Mm,
have an outside agency. For one, they go internal. They don't talk to each other. In fact, I was like, can I have the same discount code for both? They're like, no, your Instagram code is this, your podcast code. And so it's interesting because even, the brands themselves, the agencies themselves have to figure out this space. And so, at our core, I think there's 3 core things we're doing right now, which is Instagram, which is our top of our funnel, podcast and newsletter. And then, beyond that, it's like, how do we grow on YouTube and TikTok? YouTube, because it is the video platform, it is the search platform, it is incredibly large. So how do we build content that'll work there? And
yeah.
TikTok mainly because of just it's the last social platform where you could have massive growth. Some people get 1 million TikTok followers off of one video, right? And
Right.
so I think it's a mistake to ignore that. But then of course, like, you have Twitter, aka X, right? You have Threads. I mean, there's a bunch of others, and I think the decision we have to make is it, and then of course there's I shouldn't ignore LinkedIn and Facebook there. But then you're like, I'm a startup trying to build 9 great platforms, like on 9 different, like I can't do that. Like that's not
Yeah.
even, that is very challenging. And to do it well, you have to customize the content for those platforms, and play to each of those platforms. So I think
Right.
that, that's the question, is not to ignore stuff. I feel like, you if you watch like a Gary Vaynerchuk video, he's always like, get on this, you got to get on this, you got to like,
Right.
I think that we're going to try to be quick to embrace new platforms, knowing that 9 out of 10 of them might not survive long term, and 10 out of 10 of them might not be monetizable. And so it's a matter of what works best. And I think that's where being small allows us to be agile and, constantly reassessing, every couple months, like, are we devoting the right amount of time and resources to the various platforms?
So top of the funnel is Instagram, podcast, and newsletter, you said?
Yeah.
Right? That's the Mo Premium is essentially.
So podcast is free daily. The newsletter is
Yes.
free daily. The Instagram's free daily. And then each of them have a premium offering. So
Gotcha.
you get extra,
Yeah.
like beyond the daily offering, you get, a separate Instagram account, a separate podcast. And then, in the newsletter space, we'll be offering extra newsletters to the subscribers.
Got it. And what do you use for the premium subscription management piece? That's not a Substack or no, you're just using
We decided to go independent. So a couple of the
okay,
platforms we're using Memberful.
Memberful.
Memberful for our premium offering. Memberful is backed up by Stripe. We built a website that's partially Squarespace, partially WordPress, because WordPress plugs into Memberful. We had to use Zapier as a link between the two. I mean, as you know, like the tech stack is always challenging with all of these. So Memberful for that subscription piece, and then the various stuff for the website. And then hopefully between all of that, that'll enable us to build out our courses on the website and really kind of launch a 2.0 of the website, which we hope to do in the coming months.
Wow. That's awesome. So, and by doing that, I mean, one, you have the flexibility to, maybe, do some things that say Substack wouldn't let you do or doesn't have the capabilities for, so you can perhaps innovate. And then you also save, the VIG, whatever the percentages that they take. I haven't kept up with it.
There's a percentage that everybody takes. Memberful takes a take, Stripe takes a cut, that's the challenge with any of these. By the way, our newsletter we've launched on Beehive.
Right.
So Beehive was founded by a co-founder of Morning Brew. So we're actually using Beehive as the back end to our newsletter. And so, each of these have their challenges. One of the lessons I learned and we didn't go into this, I was part of the Facebook bulletin experiment. So for a quick moment in time, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to create a Substack competitor. They called it Bulletin. And they brought over a whole bunch of writers. They paid a bunch of us to, an annual deal to launch our newsletters on Bulletin, which for a quick second they were devoting resources to. And then as part of all the meta cuts of last fall, they completely killed. But you had like Malcolm Gladwell, Ian Bremmer, Malala Yousafzai. Like, if you look at the assortment, Mitch Albom, the assortment of people they had, Adam Grant on Bulletin, it was actually like a pretty compelling lineup of creators as a competitor to Substack, and they killed it. And I was like, you know what, honestly, after going through that and going through a couple of these, I need to just build my own thing, because like being wedded to a closed orbit platform is challenging. And by the way, it's an admission on Instagram. Like, that's why I'm building the website and the newsletter and the podcast, is because you better own your audience on those platforms. On social media, you're at the whim of those platforms.
Yeah. It's like you own the field versus sharecropping, right? I mean, you know that you're doing that when you're on Instagram, like you're building on somebody else's platform, but then you have your own platform where you're basically, getting people over to, hopefully over time. Yeah.
And so, it's great. And by the way, I'm talking to you from our new WeWork offices, because we have an annual WeWork partnership. So WeWork is cut a deal with us where, we're providing them Instagram and podcast ads in exchange for an office. Like, I have an 8-person office here at WeWork in Brooklyn. And so, we're trying to be creative with partnerships that both make sense for our audience, make sense for the partner, and also, as we're a startup, like serve a purpose for the startup.
Yeah, absolutely, love it. So what's next? What's on the roadmap? We talked about some of them. You talked about courses, and maybe another way to ask the question: where is your learning edge right now? What is it that like you're experimenting with, or you're learning about, or you're curious about in, not like in world news, but in the building of this business?
Well, I mean, one thing we talked about it briefly before we got started here is AI. How do we embrace AI? And I think that's a larger conversation right now across the media spectrum. And it's funny because news media tend to be late adopters on certain technologies. And by the way, it's what, like, some of the core issues media is facing today is the lack of understanding it had for the internet for the first, 15 years of the internet. I mean, there's a lot of examples there we could dive into. And so, I want to ensure that, I'm figuring out how I can utilize the ChatGPTs and the Bards and the various AI things that are happening. One thing that we've started to look at in the past couple of weeks is something called Opus, OPUS,
Cool.
as a video AI, which allows us to literally throw the entire video podcast into Opus, and Opus comes back with vertical video clips that we can socialize out. Which allows us to, again, be efficient, put out content, utilizing AI. So that's that's something that I'm particularly interested in. I don't want to get left behind there. I want to, also figure out best practices when it comes to some of these technologies. At our core, I want to ensure that we're also innovating for the biggest story in America for the next 16 months, which is an election. How do I tell that story? How do I cover that story in a way that makes sense for the audience, and in a way that the audience is consuming it? Because I feel like the way that some of the old places I work at are still covering elections in the same way they did. And by the way, there's certain things you don't change, but in the same way they did in the 16 cycle, the 12 cycle, the 08 cycle, the 04 cycle. And it's like, well, are there new ways we should be thinking about this? How do we hit reset on this that doesn't just involve like bigger screens and graphics behind us, which I feel like is the knee jerk for a lot of TV networks. So I want to ensure that as we think about the growth, that we're gearing the growth around this, again, the core offering, and that we can, be as effective and provide, answer the questions and provide the content that fills the gaps, and ensures that it's getting at answering the questions people have.
Any thoughts on the next election in terms of how you're going to cover it? Like, anything that you have like, okay, this is what I think we're going to do next, or how we're going to innovate?
So we're building out kind of a deep dive, get to know the candidates. And by the way, that's probably going to exist on traditional media as well, but that's something that, I'm asked about is like, tell me about
In your
Tim
voice,
Scott.
right? Yeah.
And in my voice, let me do an interesting text video combo, diving into each of the candidates. I feel like there's generally, and I'm certainly guilty of this in my previous life and even my current life as well, a dismissal of certain candidates, or well, they have no shot anyway. Well, you know what? People want to know about what's happening with RFK. The number of questions I still get about like Marianne Williamson or Vivek
Sure.
Ramaswamy, and again, having covered
By the
several
way,
of these elections.
I knew exactly who you were talking about when you said I tend to dismiss candidates, and you said then you followed it with RFK.
But that's the thing,
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah,
he's a fascinating character. And by the way, like when I go into the family history, people are fascinated by the family history of the Kennedys and Grandpa Kennedy, Joe Kennedy and his dad, and like the fact that like as we talk about bias of the DOJ, you're like, his dad was his brother's attorney general. Do you think that would fly in this day and age? So anyway, I think people are fascinated by the history of that. So I think that's one way we'll be approaching the election is just like, again, kind of just the facts, etc. One thing that I think I uniquely am able to provide, Rakesh, is also how the media covers these things, breaking down that wall for people. Like I've done some stuff on the decision desk and how networks make calls and how networks do polling. And not a day goes by without a question about like, wait, how can we tell what's happening in the country with 2,000 people? So I had the head of Gallup on recently on the podcast, and I think we'll continue to do that. But there's some core things that we still to this day in traditional media don't necessarily explain to people, but we mention all the time, and people have some real fundamental questions about. Not in a bad way, like but in a curious way, and I think that's important to explain. So I think that's one thing that you will uniquely be able to provide. The question is format and how we do it, and that's something we're figuring out.
Yeah, it occurred to me just now as we're having this conversation. You are the product. Mosh is the product of Mosh News, right? I mean, that's what people are coming for is for your voice and for your take and your all of what you described. And I think it's really great how you've taken that and experimented and figured out a model that it's going to allow you to turn this into something that continues to grow and is hopefully a more and more essential part of the news ecosystem. So I absolutely love it.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate the partnership we have with SnapStream and you giving us access to the treasure trove of live video that allows us to stay on top of the news. In fact, we're about an hour away from a Trump arraignment as we talk here. So we'll be tuned in to all the various channels you provide.
And this is webinar host overlord coming in over the loudspeakers here. This is Brennan. Hello. I want to really quick point out two questions, really super brief Q&A at the end here for everybody. First, from Daniel Me, really quick, wanted to ask about how much of a problem is it for news creators to be dependent on platforms like Patreon? I think you guys kind of just came right back to that just now.
Listen, I think that the challenge creators have right now is like the core thing, which is, can I make a living between subscribers and advertising? The ecosystem is still developing, and like I went through basically like I got to use Memberful, which uses Stripe, and then I have to go through a website and connect all that stuff. So it requires a technical expertise that many content creators don't have. So you can go to a Patreon, which is good. I think that I've joked with some media colleagues who are also figuring out this new world about like a confederation of sorts, like creating some sort of creator communities where we can all help each other out, and then you can then scale among a bunch of creators. I think an interesting example of that is Puck News, P-U-C-K, if you've heard of them, where ex-Vanity Fair editor has created that with a number of writers, someone who covers foreign policy, someone who covers politics, someone who covers business, and it's figuring that out. So it's unfortunate that good reporters out there, good journalists who are covering important stories, are struggling to make a living and have to go into public relations. No, not dismissing public relations, but that's often the route for journalists who want a reliable income and tend to be good communicators. And so, I think that Thankfully, there's, some people are making good livings off of Substack. Some people are making good livings off of podcasts. I mean, there's a lot of these platforms, but, there's also a lot of people who are struggling on those platforms. And so if there's a way to, I think we're winging it right now. We're all figuring it out. That's been part of this conversation.
Yeah, for what it's worth, Moshe, I think that part of the future, your future lies in maybe a puck-like model, right? I mean, I think that, eventually there's probably other personalities that sit alongside you that, you are the umbrella for, and and there's an argument to be made, like, why would they need you? Like, why don't they just go direct to their own audiences, right? But yeah, I think there's probably something to be gained, for there to be other faces who all have their own personalities.
Yeah, I mean, some of the creators I even mentioned, like if I could sell you a package and with that subscription, you're going to get extra content on science, an interesting model of this is like The Athletic too. The Athletic was like, I'm going to customize your sports coverage based on the teams that you care about, and then New York Times bought it for several $100 million, right? And so, I think if we create a confederation of reliable content creators in various sectors, there could be something interesting there. I think there's a lot of opportunities in this space.
Yeah, love it. Brendan, there's another question.
Yeah, Mel Olinsky on YouTube says, "Hi,
Mel.
Mosh. I missed the beginning of your talk. I'm curious, where are you getting video for Mo News, which you kind of plugged at the end there?" And she also says, "Hi, Rakesh."
It's listen, we spend, and there's no one better at this than Overlord Brennan, by the way, at scouring the internet for compelling video clips out there. The only thing that limits us is, frankly, time and personnel to find compelling video, and the fact that so much great video has never been digitized. But SnapStream for our news content, for archival stuff, we'll rely on various media organizations. It was interesting when we were covering the Titanic, the boat that went, the submersible that went down the Titanic. One of the most compelling clips was one from CBC Radio of the founder giving a tour of the submersible. And so, scouring YouTube, scouring Twitter, and the internet for this stuff. And then, as far as the breaking news stuff, that's SnapStream.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges, I'd imagine, being an independent news organization. You don't have, an AP feed or a Reuters feed, et cetera, right? Like, where you're pulling on these, frankly, very expensive wire services.
That's the challenge. But I think as we grow, we'll have to figure out, we just got a subscription to a photo service because of the newsletter.
Yeah.
And so, I take very seriously rights and clearances, et cetera. And so I think that, that's important, but these things are very costly. So we're navigating as we can. There's also a former NBC producer who started a company called TMX, which is in the business of clearing video. And so, there's a few affordable entities out there to access good video.
Yeah. Awesome. Hey, Mosh, thanks a lot. This is awesome. And thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Rakesh.
Thanks.